everyone, almost everything we enjoy online is really wholly or partially funded by advertising. So according to the AIB in Europe, for every €1 invested in advertising, €7 of GDP are generated. But there are some challenges and threats to the balance of that ads ecosystem. And this really requires us to work together to ensure advertising works for everyone. Google has an interest to sustain the ecosystem of the open web, which means we have the interest in protecting people that use it and the businesses that depend on it. If we want to sustain this ad-supported system, we have the responsibility to take care of it. And I know I've shared a lot of numbers with you, but I think those numbers really demonstrate that the new policies and technologies we've introduced have made the advertising space safer for everyone. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Great. So if you have a question, we've got about half our time left. Please just feel free to unmute yourself and pose it to Jessica.
I want to ask, from which industries are the most bad ads coming from? Or from which industries are the most banned websites coming from?
Because a lot of these types of scams and bad actors, they happen across all of them. So it's really hard to kind of say which one's more prevalent or what types of publishers were removing those publishers. It's more about like what are the types of scams and what are the types of abusive behavior on our ad ecosystem. So that's why we focus really on those trends, because they happen really across most of the industries and verticals that we have.
Thank you.
I think there's a question from Poland where the mic in the room isn't working. But Jessica, can you explain a little bit more about what we mean by tabloid cloaking? What is that? Well, how is it a new trend? And then what are we doing to address that specific area?
So I think that is really where you see really bad actors using what appears to be a news headline. So taking a celebrity name and saying that person has died when that is in fact not true. And those types of ads. And when you then click on that ad, because it's catchy and you think, oh, maybe someone did die and I want to understand or really just hear more about it, you actually go to a site that's not talking about that celebrity death at all. It's usually trying to sell you other things, or it's some sort of kind of scam. And so we have really set up our people and technology to try and catch some of those things and make sure that if one, is that headline true? Has that person passed away? And two, are the headline, does that match the site content? And if that's not the case, then we disapprove those ads.
And I think there was one other question from Poland, and I don't know how much you can get into this, Jessica, but are there any trends that are different in Europe compared to the rest of the world, or anything you can say about that?
I think most of these trends are global in nature, so I think we see them happening, sometimes we see them happening in one region or the other, but they usually gain pickup if they are successful. So I think actors tend to target and test sometimes in one area, but they usually go global. And so there isn't something that's like particular to Europe, or that although that is why we have a team based in Dublin, is to make sure that we're monitoring various regions to ensure that we're not just looking at global trends, that we are taking advantage of our location and understanding what's happening in the market.
Poland is asking, Jessica, more about the cryptocurrencies policy that you mentioned, and Facebook has announced something, I think a couple of weeks ago. Can you expand on that at all for us?
So I think this is one that we are announcing with this with the Trust in Ads report, and really when we take a look at new policy areas, so in this case financial products that we find to be overly complex and sometimes deceptive, we take a look at that whole vertical and do research into that. So we've been spending a significant amount of time to understand what those products look like, and we will be introducing a new policy that requires in some spaces that you have to be regulated. And in areas where there isn't regulation, we are going to take time to understand what is the best way to make sure that these sources are legitimate and we'll look into that more over the next few months. So I think there's still more to come on that. We will be announcing those changes, and when we do, Jen can kind of send along the link to what that looks like. But we're really trying to understand more about the space and as it evolves.
This global problem of bad ads, how successful do you think some of these efforts are? And where are we kind of in the fight to keep advertising, the advertising ecosystem clean for users and publishers and advertisers?
I really think that the kind of shift from 2016 to 2017 just shows how successful we have been with our new technologies, and then also with the kind of people aspect of that, making sure that we have those things in place to ensure that we can kind of enforce our policies. And I think that those kind of changes in the technology have really enabled us to do this broader and at scale. And I think the final piece of kind of linking in the economic impact as we do those policy changes, for instance, with tabloid cloaking or with of just kind of any of those types of abusive behaviors, once we enforce on those regularly, we see that behavior go away. So I think it's really just trying to continually monitor ongoing trends in the coming months and ensure that we have those people, policies, and technology in place to combat these trends.
Another question from a journalist via message. There are certain sort of political aspects, perhaps, to some advertising challenges we faced over the last year. Could you just comment a little bit on our advertising policies for political speech or elections, or maybe just give a description about what we do as it relates to fake news, which I know you touched on briefly?
So I think just generally in political ads, it's really important to acknowledge that we follow just the local laws. That's always our baseline. And so we understand in Europe that every country has their own laws surrounding political ads. And sometimes that involves silence periods, so we make sure that that's enforced on our systems. And sometimes that includes what type of information has to be included in the landing page. So we actively work with our partners to make sure that we're enforcing those correctly. And then the other piece is that political ads generally have to fall within our other policies. So that includes dangerous or derogatory, so making sure that those ads are not offensive or do not offend protected groups. And the second piece is around misrepresentation. So I think, it's not Google's job to kind of censor the web or any of that type of thing. We were really focused on making sure that the advertisers themselves aren't misrepresenting or hiding who they are. So that's where we take into account the misrepresentative policy to ensure that it's very clear who that advertiser or publisher is, and not trying to pretend to be, in my example, the New York Times, when in fact they're not.
And I think the final question we have is related, I think, to exactly what you just said around misrepresentative content and how do we use our advertising policies to make sure we are not allowing advertising to run on quote-unquote sort of fake news sites. Can you just explain for folks again what exactly that misrepresentative ads policy is as it relates to misrepresentative content on the web?
And I think the first thing to point out is that, it's really, we're trying to balance that kind of freedom of expression and speech with ensuring that people aren't confused about who they are viewing content from. And so it's really focusing on allowing the freedom of expression, but ensuring that users understand what type of site they're on or who the site is. And so it's making sure that the publisher is not misstating who they are or concealing who they are or deceiving the user in any way. And I think that's kind of the focus of that.